Are you afraid of the dark?
The date is March 29th, 1970. This is Dr. Edwin Haskins, Session 2 with patient Danica Elizabeth Battery, age 27 years, Caucasian female. Frankie listened intently. Danica, dear, there's plenty of light now, yes? He asked gently. Yes. Danica's familiar, breathy voice sounded softly. How are you feeling today, Danica? He asked in a chipper sort of tone. There was no reply. He cleared his throat and continued. The maternity nurse has expressed concern to me recently. She says you have been having intercourse, but you won't tell her who you're having intercourse with. Frankie's eyebrows shot up at that moment in disbelief of what she had heard. She felt a snicker swell in her chest like a schoolgirl who had just walked in on two teachers bumping uglies. Will you tell me, dear? Haskins asked in a calm, trustworthy tone. I already told you his name, Danica said nervously. Her voice shook in such a way that it seemed she was anticipating something to jump out at her. Ah, yes, a Mallard Vifit, am I not mistaken? He replied as though reading the name. It's actually a very clever anagram I hadn't noticed until after I'd closed my office for the day and I was reading over your file. Haskins' voice was low and becoming direct as he spoke, almost as though he was leading her, trying to make it easier to face her delusion. Do you know what an anagram is, Danica? There was an exceedingly long silence, just the sound of static over the small speaker. Frankie herself was curious at this point what the anagram was. I found it quite fascinating that you would choose, subconsciously or otherwise, such a man as the sire of your child, Miss Bathory. Danica's breathing became heavier, more panicked as she spoke. You don't understand, she breathed. I understand that you are having intercourse within the walls of this hospital, Danica, and there is no way that this man could possibly be the one you're doing it with, he remarked calmly. Even if this person were not long dead, the fact still remains that you are not allowed visitors, so this draws the only natural conclusion of either a member of staff or another patient, he finished. She stayed silent, save for her rapid, heavy breath, the cadence hinting at a terror that even Frankie could not grasp an understanding of. We know you're being raped, Danica, Haskins said gently. It's not your fault. You're a victim, dear. Frankie felt then like she would be sick. But we have to know who's doing this to you. We can't stop it if we don't know. Mallard Vifit, she whispered heavily. Mallard Vifit does not exist, Danica. He's just an anagram. A figment of your subconscious mind. He was trying desperately to calm her down, and Frankie could tell. Danica gasped in a breath of air, her voice suddenly becoming steady and eerily calm. Perhaps he will come to you in the dark then, Doctor. Perhaps he will tear you open like petals of agony and drink from your very being. Maybe he will slither inside of you and take you with merciful violence. Maybe he will love you too, Doctor. And then we shall call him a figment of your subconscious. As she said it, a small chime echoed over the recorder. Unfortunately, Danica, that marks the end of our session for this week, Haskins said, seemingly unfazed as he grunted and stood up. I want to continue this conversation next week, my dear. He continued as his voice began to sound further and further away. Don't worry. We will get to the bottom of this, he finished. Frankie heard a door shut and the doctor's low, shuffling steps as he made his way back and sat down once more in his chair. She could hear him breathing unsteadily and a heavy sigh before he picked up the recorder and spoke. Patient has become increasingly withdrawn and seems locked in the delusion that her rapist is this mallard V-fit. This, of course, is an anagram fabricated by her subconscious for the man she believes is the father of her child, Vlad the Impaler. Frankie stared off into nothing, startled in disbelief at what she'd heard. It wasn't possible, was it? She wanted to understand and yet could not. Was there more to this puzzle that she was missing? She jumped at the sound of glass shattering nearby, tearing her uncomfortably from her train of thought. Her fingers gripped hard at the back cushion of her couch as she looked around her small abode, searching for the origin of the sound. Again the noise, louder this time, and again she jumped. It sounded like her stockpile of light bulbs being thrown against the ground in the closet adjacent to her. The thought made her heart skip a beat, and her eyes grew wide in fear and concern. It wasn't a sound like they had fallen. It sounded like they were being hurled from the shelves and smashed on the floor. She stood slowly, not even pretending she had courage enough to open the door and look inside. Her heart began to race before she even took the first step toward the door. Her palms were sweating uncomfortably, and she was significantly aware of the sound of her breathing. Her eyes darted from the closet door to her front door, her thoughts in a racing debate on whether or not to check the closet or leave her apartment. Another crash, loud enough to wake the dead. She took a step backwards toward the exit, her eyes so wide she thought they might come out of her skull. She jumped when the crashing turned suddenly to a sonic banging against the closet door. She gasped out loud and almost did not recognize the sound as her own. The banging persisted, loud and heavy against the door, as though some hulking animal were trying to break free of it. The wood began to splinter and crack beneath the force of the blows. She'd backed away so much that she felt a wall against her, and yet somehow the closet didn't seem any further from her than it had in the first place. Her heart was beating ferociously in her ears, and her breath was coming in ragged gasps. A growling erupted from within the closet that held her frozen in place with terror. The sound seemed to secrete from the very walls around her. A horrific noise, like liquid belching from behind the splintering door, in incomprehensible threats that shook her to the very core. She wanted to run, but she was too frightened to even move. She felt stuck, glued to the wall as the pounding grew louder and louder across the room. With each ear-splitting slam, the door would bow and groan, spitting chunks of sharp wood at her. She could see clearly through the crack beneath that the light had gone out inside. Dread choked her as she began to shake. She fought for a moment to keep control of her composure. Run, she thought quietly. Just run. The one place in the world she could feel safe now no longer held that sense of comfort to her. But how? How did they get in? She obsessively maintained light in every room of her home. It wasn't possible. A banging at the front door sharply followed those from the closet. She pinched her eyes shut and murmured incoherent prayers to whatever God would listen. Incessant pounding from both sides made her instinctively cover her ears. Hot tears crawled like oil down her face as she slid helplessly down the wall to a huddled lump on the floor. Like a child that saw the monster under her bed, she simply slumped there, hoping against hope that the instance was a dream, that it would somehow go away and she would be all right. Slivers of wood stuck in her hair and clung to her shirt. She knew that whatever was there would break through at any moment. The door simply would not hold that long beneath the powerful blows. She couldn't open her eyes, too frightened to see what was coming for her. A muffled voice, deep and urgent, called her name, over and over, loud and insistent. She smashed her hands painfully against her ears, trying desperately to keep the noise out. She felt herself going near mad. How close was she now to just giving up, just letting them take her? With a loud crash, the front door gave. She screamed out loud and shut her eyes tightly as she could against whatever was coming in. She couldn't think and found it difficult to breathe through her panic. When a pair of cold, strong hands wrapped around her wrists like clasps of iron, she felt her panic boil into a primal instinct for survival. She kicked, she clawed, and fought with everything in her against whatever held her so tightly, still refusing to open her eyes. The banging and pounding at the closet still persistently terrifying. She was now being shaken and shouted at. Mustering every ounce of courage, she opened her eyes. A rush of immediate comfort fell over her like a warm blanket. Moore, in all his aging, grizzled glory, held tight to her wrists and looked at her in a mixture of worry and fear. She didn't get a word out before the eruption fell once more from the closet. In a shower of wooden splinters, Moore took stance and drew his gun from the holster. At his side, pointing it to the tattered closet door. Frankie, still huddled in a panic against the wall, felt something near relief at the realization that she wasn't the only one now that heard it. But that relief quickly turned to horror when it struck her. Something really was trying to get her. Another sonic crash. Moore was steady and unflinching, making Frankie wonder how he hadn't run screaming like a child from her apartment yet. Even she wanted to leave. He simply kept his aim and advanced slowly toward the origin of the noise. "Police!" he asserted. "I don't know who you are, and frankly, I really don't give a rat's ass, but you're coming with me." His lips pursed in discomfort. As he inched his way forward, Frankie huddled against the wall watching him, her worry ever growing with each small step he took. "No," she whispered. "Don't open it." He glanced over his shoulder to her, cocking an eyebrow and motioning with his empty hand to calm down. As he did, the door exploded outward in a storm of splintering wood and glass, with a thunder so loud it could have cracked enamel. In a split second, Moore was there, shielding her from the rain of slivers, his thick shirt protecting him. "Jesus ever-loving Christ!" His voice boomed over the explosion. The air stilled suddenly, and only small bits of glass from shattered lights sprinkled around them in a glittering fog. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust when they glanced toward the closet, saw the creature thrashing against the light, now spilling into it. They saw it. It was such a comforting knowledge even through the horror of what was raging before her, lashing out against the light as though the glow were 1,000 knives slicing through it. She had to wonder, how? It was a question that burned in her. The monster opened its cavernous black maw and let out a scream toward them in a fashion more threatening than not. And at this point, Frankie knew a threat when she heard one. Its black hollows for eyes seemed fixated on her as it shrieked, lurching backward into the shadows inside. It disappeared as though it had never been. Though the entire thing lasted only a few seconds, it felt like forever to her. She felt Moore's weight shift and watched silently as he stood. It was like he moved in slow motion. His eyes never left the closet that now stood empty and in shambles. A mountain of broken glass sat at the bottom, shimmering like ice in the light pouring in from the living room. Small, shaken whimpers escaped her in light hiccups as she sat there, hugging her knees into her chest. The sound of Moore's footsteps fell in crunching hesitation across the glass and wood on the floor. His arms now looked like he had been in a fight with a feral cat, scratched and lightly bleeding against the pale, leather-like skin. He stopped where the closet door was supposed to be, looking all over the tiny, empty room, assessing in his mind what he had just seen, wondering to himself if what he saw was real. After a few moments, he took a half turn and looked at her, his eyes bordering on fear and insanity. What the bloody hell was that? The street outside was pleasantly free of more than a handful of people going about their lives in uniform style. Frankie sat staring into nothing as Moore sipped a cup of steaming black coffee, his expression one of deep thought. Usually it was Dane sitting there across from her. Not today. The cafe wasn't as busy and bustling as it normally would have been. Today there was rain, overcast, and folks forgo their coffee and their rush for shelter during weather like this. Not Frankie. This was her favorite time of year. She loved the rain, always had. Autumn was heavy with it here. It was her idea of heaven. Moore's voice sliced through the silence with its deep uncertainty ripping her from thought. "We'll talk about whatever that was later," he began. "Right now the issue is that I found out you were at the Shady Acres Asylum and He smeared his thick hands down his face in an exhausted manner, his age beginning to show clearly in his tired features. Would you care to explain? It wasn't so much a question as it was a demand. Frankie's eyes hadn't left the street outside. She stared at the dance of raindrops that fell to the concrete in an almost mesmerizing fashion. I needed answers. She had them. She said blandly, "Where is she, Frankie?" His tone was stern now, near accusing. She ripped her eyes away from the rain and looked at him, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "It took her," she replied. Morris wiped his hand over his balding pate and sat back, heaving out a hard breath. "What took her?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He slammed his hand down on the table impatiently, catching himself as he did, and motioning apologetically to her when she jumped. He leaned forward and palmed his face for a moment in exacerbation. "Frankie, at this point, I'm ready to believe anything," he began, his hands doing his talking as well. She looked at him blankly for a moment before spilling every detail. His expression never changed as he listened. Her story seemed to take hours to tell, and he simply sat there, quietly soaking in everything she said. When she finished, all he did was sit back and slide his hand over his caterpillar mustache before staring down at his empty cup, as though there was something there to see. "Call me crazy if you want," she started. "I'm telling you the truth." She said it in her most uncaring tone. "After today, Frankie," he said unevenly, "I'd be just as crazy, wouldn't I?" She looked at him then, wondering if what he had said was an acknowledgement of her truth, or telling her he truly thought she was insane. "Okay, girl," Moore said gruffly as he motioned for the waitress behind the counter for more coffee. "I need you to listen to me now," he told Frankie abruptly. An ugly thunder roared outside as she sat staring at him, wondering what it was he wanted to say. Good or bad, she wasn't ready to listen to anything, but aside from Dane, this man was the only friend she really had. "I have no idea what the bloody hell that was in your apartment," he began. "But whatever it was definitely there. I heard it. I saw that door explode, and there's no earthly reason for it to have happened. Okay? I was there." He said it as though he were trying to convince himself rather than reassure her. She simply listened, waiting patiently for the point to emerge. "Your mother," he took a moment before continuing, rubbing his forehead impatiently as though he couldn't believe what he was about to say. "Your mother was committed by a friend of hers. His name was Eric something. I don't remember his last name right now, but..." He trailed off. She could see his eyes gloss over as his thoughts wandered elsewhere, someplace far in the past. She was convinced. It took him a moment to spit out what it was he had to say, as though he were distracted by the past. She was convinced she was being raped by the devil. In her mind, the devil was Vlad Tepes. She'd heard the same from the taped sessions she listened to. So she was insane. What was he getting at? She was convinced that Elizabeth Bathory had made a pact with him, that she would feed him maidens from the castle in town if he promised her eternal youth and beauty. He worried again at his forehead as the waitress poured him another cup of coffee. He gave her a charming smile, and Frankie had almost felt jealous for a split second. Beneath the stress and the bronzed badge, he was a very handsome man, with a very handsome smile. For that brief moment, he was dashing. The problem is, he continued after the coy waitress had sauntered away, that she promised him her descendants as well. When he finished his sentence, he heaved back into the seat once more, drawing his steaming cup to his mustachioed lips and sipping loudly. She was pregnant twice in that place. His gruff voice muttered as he clinked the cup back onto the table and licked his lips. Once with Clyde, once with you. His mind wandered again. He looked confused now, far away and lost. Frankie felt something in the form of pity and dread, welling up in her chest like a deep, dark hole. Everyone thought maybe an orderly, but no one could be sure. She never pointed fingers, she just kept saying it was him. But she was crazy, right? So no one would believe her. His eyes focused on her, serious and uncertain at the same time. I'm starting to wonder now, kiddo, he began in a whisper. If maybe she wasn't so crazy after all. Frankie couldn't help but feel that all of this was just a conglomeration of nonsense. But then again, she'd felt that way many, many times now, hadn't she? She pushed the feeling aside, all too aware of what was truly happening to her now. Either way, he said, his tone rough and uneven. That hospital was abandoned years ago, shut down after a couple of orderlies were caught abusing patients, rape, violence, drugs, the whole nine. Even the murder of Clyde. He paused for a moment, looking as though he had been taken back in time. That was the first time I had ever seen a dead body. Still a rookie, for Christ's sake. I remember thinking it's not like the movies, but the way we found him. He looked then like he would vomit. Frankie thanked her lucky stars that he didn't. Danica Bathory disappeared 12 years ago. Her nurse, Abby, was found in the basement with her throat cut, sliced clean from ear to ear with her own nail file. There was talk, of course, some assumed the orderlies, but it was determined later she'd done it to herself. Nobody has seen hide nor hair of Danica since she went missing over a decade ago. He took another sip, emptying the cup. Short of her resurfacing, I can't imagine how you'd have spoken to her. Then again, not much about today makes any sense. He never looked up at her when he said it, just stared into the empty mug in his hand. Frankie looked then out the window, and the babble of the street was quiet today, eerily so. But it was also beginning to show the first signs of dusk. It was time to get away from the shadows.